I'd like to welcome you to PRI's first Substack Live, where we're going to be discussing the latest findings with respect to how Americans feel about the job that the president is doing. This is a bit of a sneak peek. A week from today, we're actually releasing a larger survey report called Competing Visions of America: Politics, Religion, and American Identity. And so hopefully you can tune into that for next week. This Substack Live event is the culmination of PRI's Day of Giving campaign, which is centered around the theme of data and democracy. And throughout the day on our social medias outlets, we've been making the case that public opinion is essential in a representative democracy. And for nearly 2 decades, PRI has been guided by a core conviction that any understanding of American public opinion is incomplete without a religious lens. So if you believe in our mission, you value our data, please consider making a donation today. You can go to our website at www.pri.org. I'd now like to turn to our 2 special guests joining me today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Robert P. Jones. He is the president and founder of PRI. He is an award-winning author whose latest book, Backslide: Reclaiming a Faith in a Nation After the Christian Turn Against Democracy, will be published this September. He writes weekly at his Substack, Redeeming Democracy. And for those of you who are Robbie's followers, thank you for joining us today for this Substack Live. I'd also like to introduce another special guest, Dr. Diana Butler Bass. Diana is a founding member of PRI's board. She is a theologian, a preacher, best-selling author. Her latest book is A Beautiful Year. She also writes weekly, or more than weekly, actually, at the cottage on Substack. So we're delighted to welcome her and Substack followers of Diana's today for this event here. So Robbie's going to start by going over the latest findings with respect to what Americans think about Trump's performance. Then we're going to turn to Diana for her thoughts on what these findings have to say about both the midterm elections that are upcoming, but also about the larger state of religion and American politics. I'll talk a little bit about younger voters. We'll talk about Hispanics. Some of these numbers are really, really interesting. And then if we have time, we'll perhaps get to some of the live chat questions we have on the side. So Robbie, I'm going to give it to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Melissa. I'm kind of proud to be here on, PRI's first Substack Live.
Yes.
Hooray. Joining the 21st century on Substack. So happy to be here, and happy to be here with my good friend, longtime friend, Diana Butler Bass. Before I jump into the numbers, I do want to say, so I'm so happy to have Diana here with us. Diana was one of PRI's founding board members way back in the day. And so when I was looking around for people to support this thing that only existed on paper, that we were calling the Public Religion Research Institute, and I was thinking about, boy, who would help me do this? Diana was on the very short list of early people. Diana, I think your signatures are on the founding documents. If you kind of dig through our files of kind of getting everything, legally filed back there. So thank you for all of your support. Again, it's been almost 20 years since we were having those conversations. I know back there. So thank you for that. And then many of you do know, because you're probably here from the cottage, are from the Convocation Unscripted, so where Diane and I, along with our colleagues Jamar Tisby and Kristen Dumais, have a weekly conversation. It is the Convocation Unscripted about all things religion and politics. We often pull in PRI data for that conversation as well. And one last thing is, Diana's got a book out. It's called A Beautiful Year. You should take a look at it. If you grew up with these, as I did, with these kind of go through the year with liturgy and prayer and stuff, this is the thing you want in this moment in time. It really takes you through the liturgical year, and it is a beautiful book. And so in these times where things are so challenging, so fraught, I think it's a good resource to kind of keep everybody level-headed, grounded, which, by the way, is another book title I think you had, right? As well. So anyway, with that, I'm going to jump into the data a little bit. And as Melissa said, this is a sneak preview. It's a little slice of a bigger survey we're going to release next week that is all about America's 250th anniversary and answering these big questions like, who are we as a country? Who do we want to be as a country? And what does the American public think about that? What do religious Americans think about that? We'll be answering those bigger questions next week. This week, we wanted to kind of just dive in with this look at where are we with the favorability of our current president here. And so I'm going to share my screen. And so we're just going to go all tech now. So we got the Substack Live, and we're sharing screen. Hopefully, it doesn't all blow up. But so I want to really just stay with two charts here. There's a lot here. If you want to dig in much deeper, we've got trends, as you can see. We got many other things as well. But I really just want to stay with make sure. Can you guys see it? The
It's
screen?
just coming up now, actually.
There it is. Okay, yeah,
There it is.
it took a little while. All right. So I'm just going to stay with two charts. There's much more here. Again, it's prri.org. If you want to get, it's right there on the homepage. If you want to go see and do a deeper dive here, but I just want to look at two. One of them is the decline in Trump's favorability between 2024 and 2026. And here, often with polls and then kind of looking at politics, people kind of, and PRI does too, look at Republicans and independents and Democrats. For this, we decided to slice it a little thinner. And actually, we have a 7-point partisan scale that goes all the way from strong Republican to strong Democrat. And it allows us to get a little finer grained look at the data. This is actually one of the things that PRI is known for, is having bigger sample sizes. So you can't slice the data this thinly and really look at these subgroups without a large data set. So this is a survey of 5,000 Americans conducted in the first couple of weeks of May. And it allows us to look here, and you'll see this very, very distinct pattern. Before I say anything, you'll just see the independents right here in the middle. And we're comparing numbers from a survey that PRI conducted, really our flagship American Values Survey, right before the 2024 presidential election, and this most recent data just out of the field today. And you'll see here that it really is independents. And these, by the way, are true independents. These are independents who do not lean Democrat, nor do they lean Republican. They say they don't lean either way. Mix of that, and they are they have dropped 21 percentage points since right before the presidential election. Their favorability of Donald Trump is now at, wait for it, 14% today. And you'll see the other groups that really have dropped in terms of the political lens here are independents who lean Republican. They are now at 48%. And these are groups that typically do vote Republican, but they're now below a majority. They dropped 17 percentage points since the election. And then the kind of softer Republicans who are partisans, but not as strongly, still in majority territory at 63%. But even there, they dropped 7 points. The strong Republicans really haven't moved at all, nor have strong Democrats. So it really is this kind of center and center right move that we've seen kind of pull away from the president in terms of favorability over the last couple of years. And then there's another similar chart that we have here. We have trends and all that, but just to kind of give you all in one chart, if you look at the landscape in terms of religion, and at PRI, we break out these religious groups fairly finely. Again, we have a large sample size. We're able to do this with higher confidence. And again, the things that stand out. So if independents stood out in that previous chart, the thing that jumps out at you here are Hispanic Protestants and Hispanic Catholics. Now, for those of you who maybe haven't tracked it, you should know that these two groups, Hispanic Protestants and Catholics, actually vote very differently. In most presidential elections, you will have Hispanic Catholics voting for Democratic presidential candidates. And then these last few election cycles, we've had Hispanic Protestants voting for Trump. And in fact, have voted for Trump about 6 in 10. So I think that, again, is probably the most remarkable one, is a 14 percentage point drop among a group that voted about 6 in 10 for Trump in the last presidential election. Their favorability of Trump is now down to 37%. Right. And Hispanic Catholics who only a minority voted for Trump, but still their favorability is down to 23% after a 14% drop. This group of non-Christian religious Americans are kind of Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims in that group, dropped 9 percentage points down to only 18 percentage points. And then the thing I think, if you look at it across here, is a drop across all white Christian groups, evangelicals, non-evangelicals, white Catholics, about the same among unaffiliated. But here's what's remarkable. There's really only one religious group in the entire religious landscape now that has a favorable view of Trump, and that is white evangelical Protestants. They are still 2/3 favorable. Believe it or not, that's a drop of 5 percentage points. So he's lost ground even among white evangelicals, but they're still with him by a margin of 2 to 1. But it's notable that that is the only group in the religious landscape that is in majority territory. You now have the mainline are non evangelical Protestants below majority, white Catholics below majority here. That's something quite new. Both of those groups, by the way, voted in favor of Trump about 6 and 10, like Hispanic Protestants. So those are two Trump supporting groups that are below 50% as well. So I'm going to like park the bus there and turn it over to historian extraordinaire here, Diana Butler Bass, and get her to kind of give us her thoughts on, wow, what do we make of all of this?
Well, I always love talking about numbers, Robbie. You give me numbers, and I try to think about historical trends. So, translating numbers into how we're living the stories on the ground, I think is really important. I'm sort of fascinated by the fact that in all of the white groups, the favorability drop is the same. It's less 5, less 5, and less 5. And so you might look at that and say, that's pretty interesting. Who are those white people? And what is the thing that is swaying them? And I'm really interested in that question. And then you look at how big the percentages were of that same group that voted for Trump originally. And also I'm kind of geeky about this. So I went back to the high numbers as well, because the original numbers
Mm.
from September 24, Trump actually went up in all of these categories. And so to see him go down so far across the board with white people is very interesting. But the -5 among white evangelical Protestants still leaves you with a really big percentage, because it's a smaller drop. It's the same size drop, but in a much bigger group. And so it shows to me that there's a robustness in these religious communities, in these churches, where they really are holding on to Trump. And this is even after things like the Trump Jesus AI meme, where some evangelical pastors got very upset by that. It's to me at least encouraging to see that white mainliners and white Catholics are finally below 50%. And I am absolutely positive that that's attributable to immigration issues and what happened specifically in Minneapolis in January. That's when you saw a really big drop into March 26th. Both of those communities care about immigration, and both of them have done a lot religiously to support immigration in the United States. And so that they are reacting to that is no
Mm.
surprise.
You want to
Um,
say just a little bit about that, about kind of the positionality of mainline in that upper Midwest, area of the country, and yeah, their history there of like refugee resettlement, and just to kind of round it a little more. I know I've heard
it's
you talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's almost like if you wanted to insult the main line, the white main line, the place where you would go to do it would be the upper Midwest, because that is the place where these denominations, the old white label denominations, Lutheran, Methodist, etc. This is one of the places where they're the strongest. And in Minnesota, in particular, they're one of the majority religious communities as far as Lutherans are concerned. And when ICE came in and went after the immigrant community, they went particularly after Somalis. There were other immigrant communities they also attacked. But the Lutherans have had a big impact on bringing Somali refugees to the United States, have a multi-decade relationship with the Somali community, and have supported it through its history now in the United States from the late 20th into the beginning of the 21st century. And so when they came after the Somalis, it was literally like for the white Lutherans of Minnesota, attacking their friends and neighbors. These are the people that they
Yeah.
supported to bring here as refugees. And so
And
that
often
has
supported. I was
Go
just
ahead.
saying with the support of the federal government, right? They
Yeah,
were
with
co-op.
mm,
Yeah.
that's correct. Their social services organizations were supported by both the churches and
Yeah.
by money from the federal government. And it's really that way, kind of all scattered all through the Midwest in places where towns and counties were in decline. A lot of religious groups brought in refugees. In Iowa, and in Ohio, the Haitian community was supported by, I believe it was the Congregationalists and the Methodists. And so it was almost like a targeted sort of
Mm.
way of kicking these white mainline churches in the teeth and saying, all this work you've done, which you have seen previously as good work benefiting both America and your own religious command to love your neighbor as yourself, and to treat refugees and immigrants well. All that work, that was for nothing. As a matter of fact, we're going to undo your good work. And people were really, really angry. And that's when you started seeing pastors and members of congregations, people who are obviously religious folks, flooding the streets and standing up for their neighbors. And so that I was certain when that was happening that I could almost hear the numbers dropping like a rock. And that's exactly what happened in your survey. And so that's really significant. It's a very similar situation among white Catholics and their views of immigration, and also the ways they've participated with the federal government and bringing especially communities from Africa and also from Latin America to the United States. So that's to me that seems like it explains that drop. As the immigrant issue gets a little quieter or seems a little bit more under the surface, you might see that number bounce a little bit. I think it will get a little fungible because white mainliners and white Catholics also tend to be fairly patriotic. So if they get to be convinced that they need to support a president during wartime, you might see a couple of those numbers rise just a little bit, but I don't expect them to go over 50% anytime in the near future. And then the other piece religiously is the fascinating story about Hispanic Catholics and Protestants. And that is fascinating just to see how much Hispanic Protestants were voting like evangelicals and how they're not right now. The numbers are very, very different in your survey. And just to see that Hispanic Catholics have been one of the groups that has been most resistant to Trump all along, and they continue in that same pathway. This is going to make a huge difference in Arizona, California, Texas, Florida, and New Mexico, all those states with huge, huge Hispanic immigrant populations. I would say in Texas, this is the real wild card number.
Yeah. I think that's right. And to note that, in many of those states you named, the Catholic vote is overwhelmingly Latino, right? In
That's
those
right.
in those states. I mean, so it to alienate Latino Catholics, in that world is not, and Latino Protestants who have voted for Republican candidates. I mean, that's a challenge. And on that, looking ahead to the midterms, one other thing I'd add is, if you look at the states that, are always the swing states and that determine presidential elections that are likely to determine the balance of power in Congress in the midterms, they're not South Carolina and Alabama, where evangelicals are so strong. They are those upper Midwest states. I mean, they're Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. These are the states where mainliners and white Catholics actually are fairly strong, and in fact, vastly outnumber evangelicals in those states. And so you lose that drop there, could turn out to be quite consequential, in the upcoming elections.
It is literally like a targeted alienation campaign. You go out, they've gone after the strongest religious groups in the two areas of the country that they need the most. The Rust Belt, going after white Catholics and white mainliners where they're super strong, and then going after Hispanics in the Southwest. where you absolutely have to have that Hispanic Protestant vote or you're just not going to win. And that's been the thing in Arizona, is Arizona has more Hispanic Catholics than they have Hispanic Protestants. It's a much more evenly sort of divided Hispanic community with a preference towards Catholicism. And so to this point, the Hispanic Catholic vote has tended to impact the Hispanic vote overall in Arizona. But if you start throwing in some Hispanic Protestants and the Catholic number is falling, you've lost Arizona. These are all swing states.
Yeah. Well, Melissa, you want to jump in?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just thought I'd spend a few minutes. It's already 3:21. I don't know
Yeah, I
how
was
that
just looking at the
I
time.
know.
Yeah.
My goodness. We could do this all day. I just wanted to talk a little bit about younger Americans and their views on Donald Trump. I've written a book called The Politics of Gen Z, and I think that those numbers are really revealing. Um, and so in 24, of course, a lot of attention was focused on the fact that Donald Trump made inroads to younger voters. Um, Really largely young men as opposed to young women. So if we look at some Pew validated voter files, which are considered to be sort of the most accurate gauge we have of how people actually voted, Trump's share of votes for young women went up from 32% in 2020 to 34%. But among young men, it went from 39% in 2020 to 46%. And I think that's important and not told. That's a story that's not told a lot, that all the exit polls showed that Trump actually had a majority of young men. But we go back and look through the data, that wasn't necessarily the case. But nonetheless, there were, I think, significant inroads that Trump made with young men. And a lot of people believed it was because Trump decided to go on to the manosphere and talk to influencers where young men were hanging out and listening, right? And so in ways that Kamala Harris did not. I think maybe around the margins that might have mattered in close races. But our analyses at PRI have found that the very biggest reason that people give for voting for Donald Trump in 2024 was the economy, right? And so a lot of these younger voters tend to be less likely to turn out, than older voters. They're hard hit by economic issues more than others are. And so I think it should be, again, no surprise that when we look at the data, and this is on the spotlight analysis, you can kind of scroll down and look at different categories of favorability and Trump views. Back in the beginning of Trump's term, 35% of young Americans gave Trump a favorable approval rating. 35%, not very high. It's now down to 24% in the latest data. It's also a matter of intensity. So one of the things we don't have in the spotlight, if you go back to the data, I think when you think about elections, you have to think not only about general favorability, but how intense those views are. We collapse Americans who say they hold very favorable and somewhat favorable views together. We also collapse those who hold somewhat favorable and then very unfavorable views together. But if you look at the intensity gap, the people that are on the two kind of very favorable, very unfavorable lines among Americans, 16% hold very favorable views of Trump. They're probably largely white evangelical Protestants, but 49% hold very unfavorable views. That's a huge intensity gap that's going to matter with respect to turnout in the election. It's even bigger among younger Americans, right? So just 10% hold very favorable views of Trump compared to almost 60% who hold very unfavorable views. This is a president who is not very popular with young people. And of course, I think part of it has to do with the economy, by and large, right? The economy is worse than when Trump entered office. Many young people decided to maybe take a chance and vote for Trump, and it's not really paying off. We've had inflation going up. There's deep anxiety about AI and what it's going to do to jobs. But also the war in Iran is very unpopular among Americans writ large, but really especially among Americans who are under the age of 30. So the New York Times and Siena did a poll a couple weeks ago that found that 65% of Americans disapprove of Trump's handling of the war in Iran, 65%. It jumps to 81% among young people, 81%. And among those, 73% say they strongly disapprove. So it's an intense uneasiness and unhappiness with this war in Iran here. And last point here is the generic ballot to talk about, again, from the Siena New York Times poll. This is a measure that many political scientists and pollsters consider to kind of give us a preview of how people might be inclined to vote. So on polls, they might ask a generic, who do you tend to vote for in the House, a Republican or a Democrat? So currently among Americans, it's 51 to 35 in favor of Democrats, which is good I think, good for the Democratic Party, not so good for the Republican Party. Among young people, it's 62 versus 26 in favor of the Democratic Party. Now, the one thing to bear in mind when we think about elections and young people, they don't vote as high as other groups in society. We know that religious voters, like white evangelicals, tend to disproportionately turn out at higher numbers. But I do think that this is an area where I think the Republicans are pretty vulnerable as we head into the election. And the final thing I'll say, too, here is because, I have to talk about Gen Z and gender. The group that consistently has the most unfavorable views of Donald Trump by far are young women. So 62% of Gen Z women in our poll hold very unfavorable views, right? Only 6% of Gen Z women hold favorable views of Trump. And so this is evidence that they're just not buying all the manosphere, masculinism, trad wife content. And young women tend to vote more than young men. So I think that's something to consider as we head into the elections as well.
I thought of you as I was reading this for a completely sort of historian anecdotal story thing that I ran across this week. I have a very good friend in North Carolina who is basically a socialist. And he goes every week to a cigar bar that is this incredibly place populated with mostly men, and they're mostly under 40, and they all sit around and smoke cigars together. So during the election run up, he was telling me all the whole time in 2024, Trump's going to win, Trump's going to win, Trump's going to win. And he was talking about the attitudes of the young men he was hanging around with in the cigar bar. This last week, I was on the phone with him, and almost all of the young men who he hangs out with had gotten letters in the last 2 to 3 weeks from the federal government that ended their student loan programs. And so this is something that's not showing up in any of the mainstream news, but the act that Biden passed that pulled back student loan payments, those are all gone now. And my friend alone had gotten a bill from the federal government for $10,000. And so right now, as you all might have even been in the field with this polling, is that young adults across the country were getting these letters saying that their student loans were no longer in a status of being forgiven, and that they had to now re-enroll in payment programs, and that they were going to owe XYZ so many thousands of dollars. So it is the economy in general, but there's a very specific issue that had impacted that election. It was about student loans and the affordability of higher education. And that loan is back, or that issue is back front and center among young adults.
Wow, I had not heard that either. I knew that they were trying to reconfigure some things, within the now defunct, I guess, Department of Education. But wow, that's pretty shocking. Robbie, we have a few minutes left, but any final thoughts that you want to share with respect to what these data tell us about what we can expect this fall?
Yeah, I'm just reminded too that when you look at this data, I mean, you really do see that it's like a third of the country, supporting the president's current agenda, and we see this pattern over and over and over again. It's like one third, 2/3 are over here. We'll have some more data on this next week about what kind of a country do Americans want to live in, right? And we're seeing this 2/3, 1/3 pattern. The real challenge is when it comes down to voting is turnout. And I think that's going to be the real key. That affects young people who turn out slightly lower rates than older Americans do. And so if you've got super turnout among kind of Trump's base and then lower turnout amongst others, the opinions of the country won't be reflected in those electoral outcomes. And I think that's just a real wake up call. That, part of democracy. I mean, the good news about public opinion polling is that we can tell people, like, this is where the country actually is. It's not over there. It is actually over here. Right. But the only way that gets translated into a kind of policy and governmental reality is if those people turn out and vote and express their opinions, at the ballot box. So, here's hoping that the country, that we will have a democracy that is more representative of the actual views of the country that we see, in high quality public opinion polling like this.
Wonderful. Diana, any final thoughts as we close?
Oh, I just noticed in a comment thread that someone said that the Somalis weren't the main target of ICE in Minnesota. They were the main target rhetorically
Mm.
of the president, and I think of the larger public discussion. And I think there were lots of reasons for that because people understood just there was a face to it. Representative Omar
Mhm.
as a Somali. And also, we got to say it has to do with race. Those are immigrants that are out there, and they're black. And the other racial groups, of course, were Hispanic and Asian, and they're the Hmong people, which again were supported very strongly by the Catholic Church and by Lutheran Social Services in the Upper Midwest. And there are a lot of Hispanic immigrants in the Upper Midwest as well. And so apparently more people got arrested out of the Hispanic communities and out of the Asian communities overall. But when Trump talked about it, the Somalis were really kind of the face of that attack in Minneapolis and the Twin Cities area. And so I just want to make sure we, when we talk about immigration, there's a couple of different levels of it. There's the how the president talks about it, who are his targets, and then what's happening on the ground, who is actually getting arrested, who's experiencing the harm. And in both levels, the churches up there were aware and very upset, and they were impacted very strongly across the board by both the public prejudice and the actual execution of the plan.
Yeah, and I think too, the Trump administration consistently going after and trying to blame the Somalis on fraud with respect to daycare. I mean, it's an ongoing running theme on a lot of far right news, and so that's the picture of who's the problem, the othering that we see. And I think there's obviously also a racial component to it as well. Um, well, on that kind of downer note, I do want to talk about, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think we managed to have a successful Substack Live. A few folks have said in the chat, is this data available? Absolutely. Go to our website, pri.org, and you'll see right at the top a link to this new spotlight analysis. Please tune in next week, a week from today, when we release our new major news survey report. And at the same time, if you're so inclined, this is a moment when serious public interest journalism and evidence-based research are under attack more broadly. And I think that what makes me proud of being affiliated with PRI is that we have a commitment to very gold standard methodology, to illuminating kind of the facts, and bringing, this rich kind of analysis about where the public stands on sorts of things. So if you consider our work important, please make a gift today. You can go to our website at pri.org. Our goal is to try to keep illuminating the role of religion in American politics and culture, and to keep that research available to everyone. So please consider making a gift. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us. Follow our work on PRI. Special thanks to Diana for coming and giving us some wonderful insights into what our new survey findings are. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.